By the time the town noticed something was wrong, the letters had already been read. They appeared overnight in a quiet coastal town in Massachusetts, resting inside mailboxes that had been empty only hours earlier. Each envelope was clean, unmarked, and bound with a thin strip of black ribbon drawn tight in a precise knot, the kind used when closure matters more than appearance. There were no stamps, no return addresses, no indication that the letters had traveled any distance at all. What unsettled people first was not the writing, but the date. Every letter bore a date that had not yet arrived, written calmly in the upper corner, as though time itself had been consulted and found cooperative. The town woke beneath low clouds and salt-heavy air, unaware that several of its residents were holding something that did not belong to the present. Morning routines continued out of habit, coffee brewed, doors closed, cars pulled away from curbs, while the future sat folded in careful thirds inside white envelopes. At first, the letters were treated as oddities. By mid-morning, they were treated as coincidences. By noon, no one was using either word anymore. Each letter had been written by hand, and not in a way that suggested imitation. The pressure of the pen varied naturally. The lines drifted where attention might have wandered. The handwriting belonged to its recipient with a familiarity that could not be argued away. It carried the same unconscious habits people developed when they believed no one would ever examine their letters closely. Inside, the messages described losses, but not the kind people prepare for. They spoke of moments so ordinary they would have gone unnoticed if they had not been recorded in advance. A conversation that would seem insignificant until it ended something permanent. A choice made out of convenience rather than conviction. A silence that would last just long enough to change the shape of a life without announcing itself as damage. The letters did not plead or threaten. They read like documentation, as if someone had observed the future patiently and written down only what was certain to matter afterward. Details appeared that made dismissal difficult. Objects that did not yet exist. Words that had not yet been spoken. A stain, a pause, a glance held half a second too long. The kind of details no one plans, but everyone remembers once they have passed. As the day progressed, unease moved through the town in subtle ways. Conversations shortened. People hesitated before finishing thoughts, uneasy with the sensation that clarity itself might be overheard. The black ribbon binding each letter became its own unspoken symbol, something funereal, but premature, as though the town had been invited to mourn events that had not yet been lived. Security footage offered nothing. No figures passed through the streets during the night. No shadows bent near mailboxes. The letters had not arrived through any process the town recognized. They had simply been waiting. By evening, a detail emerged that stripped away what little comfort remained. Several letters belonged to people who had not written by hand in years, people who relied entirely on keyboards and screens, people who claimed their handwriting had grown unfamiliar even to themselves. Yet recognition came instantly. The letters felt intimate in a way that bypassed logic. They were undeniable. Some residents destroyed their letters without opening them. Others hid them, as if paper could forget what it had already been asked to hold. A few read their letters again and again, searching for errors that never appeared. One letter, however, stood apart from the rest. It was addressed to a woman who avoided handwriting entirely, who treated paper as inefficient and unreliable. She had not written a letter in years and could not recall the last time she had formed sentences with ink. The envelope waiting for her was bound with the same black ribbon. The handwriting inside was exact. Not approximate. Not convincing. Exact. It described a decision she had not yet made, but one she had been carrying silently for months, turning it over in her thoughts without ever allowing it to surface fully. The letter also described what would follow, a consequence she feared enough to keep unnamed, yet recognized the moment she read it. That was when the truth of the letters became impossible to ignore. They were not predictions. They were confirmations. Whatever was being written had already been decided somewhere beyond conscious thought, in the quiet space where intentions settle long before words are chosen. The letters were not creating the future, they were revealing it, wrapped neatly in black ribbon and placed where it could no longer be avoided. And if that was true, then the question facing the town was not whether the events would occur. It was who, or what, had begun recording decisions before anyone believed they had been made. The letter stayed with her longer than the fear. She read it once in the kitchen, standing, unwilling to sit as though stillness might allow the words to root themselves deeper. Then she folded it carefully, returned it to the envelope, and retied the black ribbon exactly as she had found it. The knot came back together with unsettling ease, as if the ribbon remembered its purpose. Her name was Martha Hale, and she had built her life around efficiency. Decisions were made with lists. Emotions were handled privately, revised internally until they became manageable. She did not keep journals. She did not write letters. She had not trusted handwriting since she learned how easily paper could outlast intention. That was why the letter unsettled her more than the others. It was not the date. It was not the accuracy. It was the familiarity. The letter described a choice she had not yet made but had already practiced avoiding. A quiet decision, one she framed as temporary postponement rather than refusal. The letter did not accuse her of indecision. It simply acknowledged it, and then moved past it, outlining what would follow once the delay ended. Martha recognized the shape of her own thinking in the structure of the sentences. The restraint. The careful avoidance of emotional language. Whoever had written this had not imagined her thoughts. They had recorded them. By the second night, sleep became impossible. The town itself seemed altered, not dramatically, but subtly, as though it had learned something it could not unlearn. Neighbors spoke less. When they did, conversations felt incomplete, interrupted by pauses that carried more weight than words. The letters had not caused panic. They had caused attention. Martha did what she always did when uncertainty refused to resolve itself through logic. She researched. She cross-referenced. She searched for patterns that could be explained away. Pranks required coordination. Coordination left traces. Nothing about the letters behaved like a plan executed by people who expected to be discovered. It was during one of those sleepless early mornings that the name surfaced. She could not recall where she had first heard it. It did not arrive as a memory, but as recognition, quiet, unforced, already present when she noticed it. Rowan Graves. The name carried no description, no context, no promise of answers. It simply persisted, repeating itself whenever her thoughts drifted too close to denial. By dawn, she had accepted what logic could not justify. If the letters had not been written by someone seeking attention, then whoever was responsible did not need to be found. They needed to be understood. Salem received her without ceremony. The historic streets closer to the water were already awake with noise and movement, but Martha did not stop there. The address that had formed in her mind led her away from tourists and storefronts, into a narrower part of the city where the buildings stood closer together and sound seemed to dull itself out of habit. The house did not announce itself. It was a two-story wooden structure darkened by age and rain, its windows tall and narrow, the frames heavy enough to feel permanent. A small hand-painted sign hung beside the door, the lettering uneven but deliberate. Rowan Graves. Private readings. Nothing else. Inside, the air felt older than the house itself. The room was modest, painted a deep gray that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. There were no decorations meant to reassure. No music. No incense. Just a solid wooden table scarred by years of use and a single lamp casting warm light across its surface. Rowan Graves was already seated. He did not stand when Martha entered. He did not ask her name. He did not ask why she had come. His presence shifted the room without movement, as though the space itself had adjusted around him. When he reached for the deck of cards, the motion was unhurried, almost procedural. The cards were old, their edges softened, the images dulled by repeated handling. He did not ask a question aloud. He did not invite Martha to touch the deck. 5 cards were laid out in silence. The first revealed her current state, not fear, but suspension. A life paused between acknowledgement and action, held in place by restraint mistaken for control. The second showed a severed connection. Not between people, but between intention and admission. Something known but unspoken, allowed to persist because naming it would demand change. The third marked the moment of distortion. Not a lie, but a revision. Reality adjusted gently, repeatedly, until the original truth no longer recognized itself. The fourth card explained the letters themselves. Writing as fixation. Ink as commitment. The form chosen because it does not forget and does not negotiate. The final card did not describe an outcome. It described a condition. Rowan Graves did not speak of what would happen next. He spoke of what had already begun. According to the spread, the letters had not come to warn. They had come to mark the moment when avoidance stopped being neutral. He stated this without comfort and without threat. Martha understood then that the letters were not an intrusion into her life. They were a response. And whatever had tied black ribbon around her decisions was no longer waiting for her to catch up. Martha did not remember standing up from the chair. She remembered only that the room felt heavier once the cards were on the table, as though the air itself had learned something it could not unlearn. Rowan Graves did not rearrange the spread. He did not correct it. He studied it the way one studies a map that has already been used. The first card remained where it was. It showed not distress, not danger, but restraint carried too far. A figure balanced carefully, holding opposing forces apart with deliberate effort. According to the structure of the spread, this was not stability. It was delay mistaken for control. A life held in place by refusing to decide, long after the moment of neutrality had passed. The second card spoke of a connection already severed. Not recently. Not dramatically. The image suggested distance introduced slowly, with care, until separation no longer felt like loss. Something essential had been set aside with the intention of returning to it later. The card made clear that later had never arrived. Rowan Graves did not soften this. He indicated that the break had not occurred between people, but between truth and acknowledgement. The bond was not destroyed, it was suspended. And suspension, when prolonged, creates its own consequences. The third card marked the moment of distortion. It showed a turning point that had not felt like one at the time. A choice framed as practical. A compromise accepted because it avoided discomfort. The card suggested that reality had been adjusted slightly, repeatedly, until the original shape was no longer visible. Not hidden, replaced. This, according to the spread, was where the letters began. Not on paper. In intention. The fourth card explained the form the message had taken. Writing. Ink. Paper. Rowan Graves stated that writing fixes what the mind prefers to keep flexible. Spoken words can be revised. Thoughts can be reshaped. But what is written declares itself complete. The letters had not been sent to frighten. They had been sent because something required permanence. The black ribbon, he explained, was not decorative. It was a boundary. A marker placed around decisions that had already crossed from thought into consequence. The final card rested apart from the others, heavier in its implication. It did not show an ending. It did not promise resolution. It described a condition that had to be met to prevent further collapse. According to the spread, the letters would continue until the recorded decisions were either acknowledged fully or rendered impossible. Ignoring them would not erase them. Destroying them would not undo them. The structure revealed by the cards did not respond to denial. It responded to recognition. Rowan Graves gathered the cards slowly, returning them to the deck without ceremony. He did not offer reassurance. He did not suggest remedies disguised as hope. He stated only that the letters did not belong to the future. They belonged to the moment when delay stopped being harmless. Martha left the house carrying no instructions, only a sharper understanding of what had already begun. Salem felt unchanged when she stepped back onto the narrow street, but the city's indifference no longer comforted her. On the drive home, her phone vibrated once. The notification was ordinary. A calendar reminder she had set months earlier and repeatedly postponed. A decision she had labeled temporary, so many times it had begun to feel permanent. That night, another letter appeared in the town. Then another. Some were never opened. Some were read too many times. A few were found already untied, the black ribbon loosened as if by hands that had not remembered doing it. And one letter arrived without words at all. Inside the envelope was only a date, and a ribbon tied tighter than the rest. The town did not panic. It adjusted. People became cautious with plans. Conversations ended sooner. Choices were delayed past usefulness. The letters did not force events into motion. They documented what people were already doing to themselves by refusing to look directly at what they knew. Martha understood now that the letters were not warnings. They were records. And somewhere beyond the limits of the town, something patient continued its work, binding decisions in black ribbon and placing them where they could no longer be mistaken for thoughts. Because once a choice is recorded, it no longer belongs to the person who made it. It belongs to what follows. The first letter came true without ceremony. There was no dramatic moment to point to, no single second that could be named as the beginning. The loss unfolded the way most irreversible things do, quietly, disguised as normal progression. A conversation ended sooner than expected. A decision was postponed one final time. A silence extended just long enough to become permanent. By the time anyone noticed, it was already complete. Across the town, events described in ink began to surface in fragments. Not all at once. Not in the order the letters had been written. The structure did not rush. It allowed life to move at its usual pace, confident that momentum would do the work without resistance. One resident realized too late that a familiar presence had faded from daily routine without explanation. Another discovered that a choice they believed they still controlled had already closed behind them. Nothing violent occurred. Nothing visibly dramatic. Yet the weight of absence settled heavily, unmistakably. The letters had not exaggerated. They had understated. Martha watched this unfold with a clarity that brought no relief. She recognized the pattern now, not as fate, but as completion. What the letters recorded did not force events into existence. They followed them to their natural conclusion, marking the moment when possibility narrowed into outcome. Some people attempted to intervene. A few confronted the situations described in their letters, trying to undo what had not yet fully occurred. They spoke sooner, promised more, demanded certainty where uncertainty had already been chosen. The results were consistent. Efforts to reverse the course only accelerated it, as though the structure interpreted urgency as confirmation. Others chose avoidance. Letters were destroyed. Ribbons were cut and discarded. Ink was scrubbed from paper as if erasure could travel backward through time. These efforts changed nothing. In some cases, they altered the sequence of events, but never the destination. One thing became clear by the end of the week. The letters did not cause loss. They confirmed it. Martha returned to her own letter often, not to reread it, but to feel its weight in her hands. The paper remained unchanged, but her understanding of it shifted. What she had mistaken for warning now revealed itself as acknowledgement. The decision described inside was not approaching. It was waiting. Around her, the town adapted without realizing it was doing so. People spoke carefully, avoiding clarity. Plans were left deliberately vague. Commitments softened into possibilities. The letters had taught the town something without instruction, that uncertainty felt safer than truth once truth carried consequence. Yet the letters continued to arrive. Not for everyone. Only for those who lingered too long between intention and admission. Only for those who believed delay was neutral. One envelope arrived containing nothing but a date and a tightly bound ribbon. No words. No explanation. The recipient understood immediately. The loss had already occurred internally, the structure required no further description. The absence of language was enough. By then, no one questioned how the letters came. The mystery of delivery had faded beneath something heavier. The town no longer asked who was responsible. It asked why now. Martha understood the answer before she allowed herself to articulate it. The letters appeared when indecision crossed a threshold. When what had been avoided for too long began to exert pressure on reality itself. The structure did not punish hesitation. It resolved it. Late one evening, Martha noticed that the black ribbon on her own letter had loosened slightly. She did not remember touching it. The knot remained intact, but the tension had changed, as though the ribbon had adjusted on its own. She did not retie it. She understood now that the ribbon did not seal the letter to protect what was inside. It marked the point of no return. Once tied, it acknowledged that the contents were no longer hypothetical. Outside, the town remained quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that follows decisions made privately and consequences accepted without protest. The letters had not brought chaos. They had brought alignment. An alignment, once achieved, does not announce itself loudly. It simply moves forward. Somewhere beyond the visible patterns of daily life, the mechanism that recorded these decisions continued its work without urgency. It did not need belief. It did not require fear. It responded only to one thing, the moment when a choice stopped belonging to the future and became part of the present. Martha sat alone with her letter, aware that what unsettled her most was not what it described. It was the realization that nothing written inside it felt unfamiliar anymore. Because when a record stops feeling like prophecy and begins to feel like memory, the outcome has already begun to take shape. And the ribbon, once loosened, does not tighten itself again. The letter without words arrived last. It appeared in a mailbox at the edge of town, bound with the same black ribbon as the others, its envelope indistinguishable at first glance. No one noticed anything unusual until it was opened and found to be empty. No message. No handwriting. Only a date written carefully in the upper corner. The date had already passed. The recipient did not speak about it to anyone. There was no need. Whatever the letter acknowledged had already settled into place, heavy but contained, like a thought finally accepted after years of resistance. The absence of language was not an omission. It was confirmation that explanation was no longer required. Martha understood the meaning immediately. Some losses, she realized, do not require description because they have already occurred internally. The structure that produced the letters did not insist on words when words would arrive too late. Silence, in this case, was precise. She returned to Salem 2 days later. The narrow street near the historic center looked unchanged, but the walk toward the dark wooden house felt shorter than before, as though distance itself had adjusted. Inside, the room was exactly as she remembered it, dim, spare, unyielding. Rowan Graves was seated at the table, his posture unchanged, his attention already focused where it needed to be. The empty envelope lay between them. Rowan Graves did not ask where the words were. He did not touch the ribbon. He observed the date and the loosened knot, and that was enough. According to the structure he worked within, the absence of writing meant something had reached completion without resistance. He explained this without explanation. When a decision is acknowledged internally but never spoken, it does not disappear. It changes form. Instead of manifesting as action in the world, it settles inward, reshaping identity rather than circumstance. The loss still occurs, but quietly, invisibly, and permanently. The letters that followed, he indicated, would no longer warn. They would not record future moments. The structure had moved past that phase. What remained now was containment. The black ribbon had never been meant to restrain events. It marked where truth had been bound tightly enough to be carried without spilling. Once loosened, it signaled acceptance, not relief, not resolution, but recognition. Martha left Salem carrying the empty letter with care she had not afforded the others. The lack of words felt heavier than any description. It meant that what had been avoided for so long had finally been named internally, even if no sound had been made. Back in town, the changes continued. Letters arrived less frequently. Some houses received none at all. The mechanism no longer needed repetition. Those who had reached acknowledgement stopped being addressed. Those who remained in delay continued to receive reminders, each wrapped in the same black ribbon, each more precise than the last. Martha noticed something else as well. The town had grown quieter, not with fear, but with caution. People spoke less about plans. Commitments were framed carefully, as if language itself carried weight that could no longer be ignored. The letters had taught the town an unspoken rule: clarity invites consequence. One evening, Martha removed the ribbon from her own letter and placed it in a drawer. The paper remained folded, but the tension was gone. She did not feel relief. She felt alignment. The structure had not spared her from loss. It had ensured that the loss was complete. Somewhere beyond the town's awareness, the process that had bound those letters continued its work, no longer concerned with warning or record. It had moved into its final phase, one where outcomes no longer needed to be announced. Because once a decision is fully accepted, nothing else needs to be written. And silence, when it arrives this late, is never empty. The morning the mailboxes were empty was the most unsettling of all. No envelopes. No black ribbon. No dates waiting to be read. The town woke to silence where expectation had quietly taken root. People checked their mail out of habit, not hope, standing longer than necessary beside open boxes as if absence itself might clarify something. The routine had changed without announcement, and the change felt deliberate. For days, the letters had shaped attention. Now, attention had nowhere to settle. Martha noticed the difference immediately. The quiet was not relief. It carried the weight of something concluded, the way air feels after a storm that never visibly arrives. The absence of letters did not mean the process had ended. It meant it had moved beyond the need to document. She understood this before she allowed herself to think it. Throughout the town, consequences continued to surface, cleanly, without spectacle. A relationship that no longer required explanation ended with mutual acceptance. A job left behind was not replaced. A door once considered temporary closure remained shut without regret. These were not events that demanded witnesses. They unfolded as if the world had adjusted to a new configuration and saw no reason to revisit the previous one. The letters had not stopped anything. They had finished their work. Martha returned once more to Salem, not because she expected answers, but because she needed to confirm what she already sensed. The narrow street near the historic center greeted her with the same indifference as before. The dark wooden house stood unchanged, its windows reflecting nothing clearly. Inside, Rowan Graves sat at the table as he always had. There were no cards laid out this time. No envelope placed between them. None were needed. The absence itself had meaning. According to the structure he worked within, the moment for interpretation had passed. Rowan Graves did not speak of endings. He spoke of thresholds. When choices are acknowledged fully, he explained, they no longer require reinforcement. The letters had existed only to bridge the space between avoidance and recognition. Once crossed, the bridge dissolves. What remains is movement, quiet, continuous, irreversible. Martha left without looking back. In the weeks that followed, the town settled into something resembling normalcy. Visitors would have noticed nothing unusual. Streets remained intact. Houses stood as they always had. But the people who lived there carried a subtle restraint, an awareness that some thoughts were no longer safe to rehearse endlessly. Plans were made carefully. Words were chosen with intention. Silence, when it appeared, was no longer assumed to be empty. Martha kept the black ribbon in a drawer she rarely opened. The letter itself remained folded, unread now, not because its contents were forgotten, but because they no longer needed to be revisited. What had been written had already completed its work. On certain mornings, she still checked her mailbox longer than necessary. Not because she expected another letter, but because she understood now that the most decisive moments arrive without announcement, without ink, without record. They occur when no one is watching closely enough to believe they could be changed. Somewhere, the mechanism that had written those letters remained active, not as a sender, not as a watcher, but as a function of truth itself. It did not bind every decision. Only the ones delayed too long. Only the ones mistaken for thoughts when they had already become commitments. The black ribbon had never been a warning. It was a marker. And the town had learned what it meant when nothing arrived at all. Because when the future no longer needs to be written down, it has already been accepted. And acceptance, once reached, does not ask permission before it moves on.